first thing God did after the first murder in human history was protect the murderer, not punish him. He did that too. But after the sentence was handed down, after the ground itself was said to be crying out, God did something that almost no one notices, and that almost everyone who does notice gets exactly backwards. He put a sign on Cain, and for 4,000 years, people have called that sign a curse. It isn't. It never was. If you grew up hearing this story, you were handed the surface of it. 2 brothers, 2 offerings, a jealous man, a field, a stone, then a mark, a brand, a stain, a shadow on his face, and then Cain walks off the page and out of the Bible, and the story moves on to the flood. That is the version the pews were given, and it leaves out almost everything. Because the 4th chapter of Genesis does not end at the murder, it keeps going. It follows Cain east, into a land whose name means something disturbing when you translate it. It watches him take a wife the text refuses to explain. It watches a man sentenced to wander forever stop walking and build a city. The first city, and name it after his son. And then it follows his bloodline down through 7 generations to a man standing in front of his 2 wives singing a song about a killing, and it is the oldest poem in the book of Genesis, and it is a boast. And the sign on Cain's body, or on something else entirely, because the Hebrew is stranger than your translation lets on. The sign turns out to be the key to all of it. The answer is hiding in one small Hebrew word, 3 letters, and that same word is used elsewhere in Scripture for something you would never in your life associate with a curse. That word is why this story does not mean what you were told it means. Before we go into it, if you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications, so the next part of the story finds you when it comes. And leave a comment, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read them. So let us go back to the beginning of it, to a woman holding a newborn, saying something in Hebrew that translators have argued over ever since. Part 1. The name she gave him. Genesis chapter 4 opens on childbirth. Adam knows his wife Eve, she conceives, and she bears a son. And then she says a sentence. In most English Bibles it reads something like, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," and it sounds ordinary. A mother's gratitude. Move along. But the Hebrew is not ordinary. The Hebrew is one of the strangest lines in the opening chapters of the Bible, and translators have been wrestling with it for 2,000 years. What she actually says is closer to, "I have acquired a man," and then a particle, et, which in Hebrew normally marks a direct object, and then the divine name. I have acquired a man, the Lord. Read woodenly, it says something no translator wants to print, and so every translation you have ever held has quietly supplied a preposition that isn't there. With the help of, together with. From, the King James translators wrote from the Lord. The Jewish Publication Society wrestled with it. Robert Alter, whose translation of the Hebrew Bible is among the most careful in English, flags the line as genuinely obscure. Here is what matters for our story. Whatever else that sentence is doing, it is doing one thing beyond dispute. It is telling you who this child's parents are. Adam knew his wife. She conceived. She bore Cain. The text puts Adam's fatherhood in the first clause of the first verse, and it will matter enormously later when we get to a claim about Cain's parentage that some people still teach, and that the text itself demolishes in its opening line, and she names him Cain. Cain, the name, is a pun. Hebrew narrative loves puns on names, and this one plays on the verb kana, to get, to acquire, to create, to possess. She acquired him. She names him acquisition. Then, almost as an afterthought, the text says, and again, she bore his brother Abel. No sentence for Abel. No naming speech, no pun explained. His name is Hevel, and Hevel is the word the book of Ecclesiastes uses over and over for breath, vapour, mist, the thing that is gone the moment you see it. Whether the narrator intends that is debated among scholars, but the shape on the page is impossible to miss. One brother gets a birth announcement, the other gets a half line and a name that means a puff of air, and then the professions. Abel was a keeper of sheep. Cain was a worker of the ground. Notice what the ground already is at this point in the story. One chapter earlier in Genesis 3, the ground itself has been cursed, thorns and thistles, by the sweat of your face. Cain is not a farmer in some pastoral idyll. Cain is the man whose whole life is spent fighting soil that the text has already told you is fighting back. Hold on to that, because when the punishment comes, God will not take Cain's life. God will take the ground. Part 2. The offering with no reason given. In the course of time, the text says, Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Now, why? I want to be very careful here, because this is the exact place where sermons rush in and the text goes quiet. And the quiet is the point. Genesis does not tell you why. It states the outcome and gives no reason. It does not say Cain's heart was wrong. It does not say the offering was blemished. It does not even tell you how the two men knew which offering had been accepted. The detail you may have heard, that fire came down and consumed Abel's sacrifice, appears nowhere in the chapter. That is an interpretation, and a very old and popular one, but it is not in the text. What the text does do is describe the two offerings differently, and the difference is worth hearing in Hebrew. Abel brings Bechorot, firstlings, the firstborn, and their Kelev, the fat, which in the later sacrificial law of Leviticus is specifically the choicest portion, the part reserved for God. Abel's offering is described with two words that both mean best. Cain's is described as of the fruit of the ground. No first, no best, just some. So there is a hint, but a hint is not a statement. An honest reading means saying so. Now later writers filled the gap, and their answers became the answers most Christians carry. The letter to the Hebrews says that by faith Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. The first letter of John says Cain's works were evil and his brother's righteous. Those are canonical texts, and for a Christian reader they carry authority, but notice what they are doing. They are supplying a reason that Genesis 4 withheld. The New Testament is interpreting, and it is doing so centuries later. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, gave a different answer entirely. In his Antiquities he says God was more pleased with what grew of its own accord than with what a covetous man had forced out of the ground. Philo of Alexandria, writing Allegory, made Cain the very type of self-love. Augustine, 4 centuries after that, read the two brothers as two cities, the earthly and the heavenly. 4 great interpreters, 4 different reasons. Because the text gave none, and there is one popular answer I want to take off the table, because it circulates constantly and it does not survive contact with the rest of the Bible. That answer is blood. God accepts animal sacrifice and rejects grain. Full stop. It sounds neat. But the second chapter of Leviticus commands grain offerings, the mincha, as an acceptable offering to the Lord. If grain were categorically unacceptable, the Torah would not require it. So whatever separated these two offerings, it was not simply that one had blood in it. There is one more layer, and it is the one that opens the story out into the wider ancient world. Scholars of the ancient Near East have long noticed that the herdsman and the farmer was a stock literary pairing. There is a Sumerian debate poem, usually called Dumuzid and Enkimdu, in which the goddess Inanna chooses between a shepherd god and a farmer god, and in the version we have, the shepherd wins. But here is where careless documentaries overreach, so I won't. In the Sumerian poem, the two rivals reconcile. The farmer concedes, offers the shepherd grazing rights, and they part as friends. Nobody dies. William Hallow, one of the great Sumerologists, thought the poem was a rough model for the type. Other scholars call the direct comparison flimsy for exactly that reason. What we can say safely is that Genesis is using a familiar ancient pairing and then doing something with it that the Sumerian poem never does. It ends it in a field with a body. But not yet, because before the murder, God speaks to Cain, and what God says to him contains one of the most genuinely unsettling images in the Hebrew Bible, and your translation has almost certainly softened it. Part 3. The thing crouching at the door. Cain's face falls. The Hebrew is physical, his face fell, his countenance dropped. And God asks him 2 questions, and then says this: if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Sin is crouching at the door. The word translated crouching is rovitz. It comes from a root used of animals lying down, a beast at rest, or a predator flattened low, waiting, already that is a vivid picture, sin as something with a body, something with haunches, pressed against the threshold of Cain's tent. But there is a grammatical problem in that sentence, and it is the kind of problem that opens a door. In Hebrew, the noun for sin, chatat, is feminine. The participle rovitz is masculine. They do not agree. And in a language as tightly inflected as Hebrew, that mismatch is a flag. Something is off. Either the text is corrupt, or rovitz is not simply describing sin, it is naming something. E.A. Spicer, who wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Genesis, argued that it is naming something. He pointed to Akkadian, the language of Babylon and Assyria, where there is a word rabitsu, and a rabitsu is not an abstraction. A rabitsu is a demon, a croucher, a threshold spirit, sometimes protective, sometimes malevolent, whose entire function is to lie in wait at the entrance of a building. Spicer translated the line, "Sin is the demon at the door, whose urge is toward you, yet you can be his master." The Revised English Bible printed something close to it. Sin is a demon lurking at the door. The footnotes of the New American Bible went the same way. John Walton, who works on Genesis in its ancient Near Eastern setting, notes that the Akkadian word can also carry an administrative sense, an officer, an agent, before he too leans toward the darker reading. I want to be exact about the status of this. This is not canon telling you there is a demon on Cain's doorstep. This is a scholarly reconstruction, built on a real linguistic parallel and a real grammatical anomaly, and it is one option among several. Other scholars read rovitz as simply crouching, animal-like, a metaphor and nothing more. The debate is live, and it is not settled. But it is a real debate, in real commentaries, over a real oddity in the Hebrew. And, if Spicer is right, then the picture God gives Cain in the moment before the murder is this: there is something outside your door, it is low to the ground, it is not leaving, and it wants you. Then comes the second half of the line, and this is the part that made me sit up when I first traced it. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. The Hebrew word for desire there is teshuka. It is a rare word. It occurs 3 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. Once in the Song of Songs, once here, and once, 1 chapter earlier, in Genesis 3, in the words spoken to Eve, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Same two words. Teshuka, desire, mashal, to rule. Back to back in consecutive chapters. Spoken first about a marriage, and then about a predator at a door. Whatever Genesis 3 means by that line, and it is one of the most argued over sentences in the Bible, the narrator of Genesis 4 has deliberately picked it up and reused it. The parallel is not accidental. Gordon Wenham flags it in his commentary. Scholars have built whole articles on it, and the effect is chilling. The same grammar that described the fracture between the first man and the first woman is now used to describe the relationship between a man and the thing waiting to devour him. Here is the thing about that speech though, and it is easy to miss in the horror of the image. It is a warning. God does not tell Cain he is doomed. God tells him the opposite. You must rule over it. The verb is not descriptive, it is charged with expectation. This is the last conversation before the murder, and it is God telling Cain that the murder does not have to happen. Cain says nothing in reply. The text records no answer at all. And then comes the strangest verse in the chapter, a verse that in the Hebrew you would have read in a synagogue in the 2nd century. Simply breaks. Part 4. The sentence that stops mid-breath. Here is Genesis 4 verse 8 in the Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew text of the Jewish Bible, the text behind nearly every Old Testament you own. And Cain said to his brother Abel, that is it. That is the whole clause. The verb is there, veomer, and he said, and it takes an object, and the object is missing. Cain said to Abel. Said what? Nothing. The Hebrew moves straight on, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Now open a Samaritan Pentateuch, and the words are there. Open the Septuagint, the Greek translation made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, and the words are there. Open the Syriac Peshitta. Open Jerome's Latin Vulgate. All of them have the missing line, and all of them have the same one. Let us go out to the field. 4 words. And they change the character of the killing entirely. Without them, you could imagine a quarrel that got out of hand, 2 brothers in a field, an argument, a moment of rage. With them, you have a man walking up to his brother, speaking calmly, and inviting him for a walk to a place with no witnesses. You have premeditation. So which is original? This is a genuine textual crux, and scholars land in 2 camps. The majority view, reflected in most modern critical translations, the New Revised Standard, the New International, the New Jerusalem, is that the words dropped out of the Hebrew at some early stage of copying, a simple scribal accident, and that the ancient versions preserve what was there. Others defend the Masoretic blank as original and deliberate, a narrator refusing to tell you what Cain said, leaving a hole in the sentence exactly where the invitation should be. I find both readings unnerving in different ways. Either Cain said the 4 most ordinary words in the world and used them to lure his brother out of sight, or the text knows what he said and will not repeat it. Then the killing itself. And notice how Genesis handles it. It gives you 1 verb. He rose up against his brother, and he killed him. No weapon named, every stone, every club. Every farming tool you have seen in a painting of this scene is an artist's invention, not a detail of the text. No description of the body, no last words. The Bible's account of the first murder is shorter than the account of Eve naming her firstborn. And then God speaks again, and the question he asks is the second question in the Bible. The first was to Adam, "Where are you?" The second is to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" Cain gives the answer that has echoed for 4,000 years. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And there is a bitter piece of wordplay in it that English cannot carry. Keeper, shomer. Abel was a keeper of sheep, a shepherd. Cain takes the word for his brother's occupation and throws it back as a sneer. Am I the shepherd's shepherd? Then God says, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The Hebrew for blood there is plural. Bloods, rabbinic tradition made much of that plural. The Mishnah reads it as the blood of Abel and of all his unborn descendants, which is where the famous saying comes from, that whoever destroys a single life destroys an entire world. That is tradition, not canon. It is rabbinic interpretation, written down long after. But it is built on something genuinely there in the Hebrew. And listen to where the blood is crying from. The ground. The Adama. The same ground that was cursed in chapter 3. The same ground Cain has spent his entire working life breaking open. The soil he fought is now the witness against him, which is why the sentence God hands down is the one he hands down. Not death, not exile from life, exile from the ground. Part 5. Two different things, and almost everyone welds them together. Here is the sentence in Genesis 4, verses 11 and 12. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. Stop there, because that right there, is the curse of Cain. All of it. Two things. The ground will not feed him, and he will not be able to stay anywhere. For a farmer, this is total. His trade is gone, and his home is gone in the same breath. The man whose name means acquisition will now own nothing and hold nothing. The Hebrew for what he becomes is navanad. A pair of words that sound alike and mean nearly the same thing. A stumbler and a wanderer, a restless fugitive. Remember that phrase. It is going to come back in a place name in about 90 seconds. And Cain answers, and his answer is one of the rawest lines any character speaks in the primeval history. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. And I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and it will be that anyone who finds me will kill me. He is not repenting. Read it again, there is no confession in it. He is protesting the severity of the sentence, and he is naming a specific fear. Whoever finds me will kill me. And now God does the thing this whole story turns on. He says, not so. Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold, and the Lord put a sign for Cain, lest any who found him should kill him. That is verse 15. And I want to slow all the way down, because this is where nearly every retelling you have ever heard goes wrong. The curse and the sign are two different things. They happen at two different moments, they do two different jobs, and they come from two different divine impulses. The curse is judgment, verses 11 and 12. The sign is protection, verse 15. And between them sits Cain's protest. The sign is not part of the sentence. The sign is God's response to a condemned man saying the sentence will get him killed. The mark of Cain is not the curse. The mark of Cain is the mercy that was added on top of the curse. Now the word. In Hebrew it is ot. Aleph, vav, tav, 3 letters. It means a sign, a token, a signal, something that points to something else, or guarantees it. And here is where it lands. Because if you want to know what an ot is, you look at where else the Hebrew Bible uses it. In Genesis 9, after the flood, God sets his bow in the cloud and calls it an ot, the sign of the covenant between him and all flesh. The rainbow is an ot. In Genesis 17, circumcision is given to Abraham as an ot of the covenant. In Exodus 12, on the night of Passover, the blood on the doorposts is described as an ot for the Israelites, so that the destroyer will pass over that house and no plague will fall on them. A sign whose entire function is to keep death away from the person who bears it. That is the word. That is the semantic company it keeps. The rainbow, the covenant, the blood that makes death pass by. Nahum Sarna, whose Jewish Publication Society commentary on Genesis is one of the standard works in the field, states it about as plainly as a scholar can. He writes that the phrase has been persistently misunderstood, that the reference is not to a stigma of infamy, but to a sign indicating that the bearer is under divine protection. Kenneth Matthews, in his commentary, compares it directly to the protective mark in Ezekiel chapter 9, where a scribe goes through Jerusalem, putting a mark on the foreheads of those who are to be spared. Spared, that is the category this belongs to. And there is one more piece, and it is grammatical. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Hebrew does not say God put a sign on Cain, it says God put a sign leprosy. The prefix is the letter lamed, and lamed is the dative, for the benefit of, a sign for Cain. Which raises a question your English Bible has quietly decided for you. Was it on him at all? Sarna thought a physical mark was probable, on the analogy of Ezekiel, but he explicitly allowed the other possibility, that the sign was some occurrence, some event, that served to authenticate the divine promise. In other words, not a brand on a body, a sign given to Cain that Cain could see, so that he would believe he was actually protected. And here is what the text does not say. It does not say what the sign looked like. It does not say where it was. It does not say it was visible to anyone else. It does not say it was on his forehead. The forehead is never mentioned in Genesis 4, not once, in any manuscript. Every single thing you picture when you hear the mark of Cain was supplied by somebody else, later, which is exactly where we go next. Because people could not leave that blank alone, and what they filled it with is a story in its own right. Part 6. Everything people decided it must have been. The gap in Genesis 4 verse 15 is one of the most productive silences in the history of interpretation. For 2,000 years, readers have looked at the Lord put a sign and asked, what sign? And they have answered. The rabbinic collection called Genesis Rabbah, compiled in the land of Israel in roughly the 5th century of the Common Era, preserves a whole catalogue of these answers, and it preserves them as a disagreement, which is one of the things I love about rabbinic literature. It does not pretend to a single answer. It lists the rabbis arguing. Rabbi Judah said, God caused the orb of the sun to shine on his account, light as protection. Rabbi Nehemiah objected to that and said it was leprosy. Rab said God gave him a dog. Abba Yosei said God made a horn grow out of him. And Rabbi Levi, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, said something cleverer than all of them, that the sign was not a thing at all, but a suspension. God suspended judgment on Cain, held it in abeyance, until the flood came and swept him away. A dog, a horn, leprosy, sunlight, a stay of execution. 5 rabbis, 5 answers, and not one of them claiming to read it off the page, because it is not on the page. Other traditions went further. The work known as Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer says God inscribed a letter on Cain's arm, which works as a pun, because by the rabbinic period the word ot had picked up a second meaning. It still meant sign. But it had also come to mean a letter of the alphabet. Some Christian writers took that route too, and made it the letter tau on his forehead, which conveniently looks like a cross. Ruth Mellenkoff, an art historian who wrote the standard monograph on this whole subject, published by the University of California Press, catalogued the interpretations and sorted them into families, marks on Cain's body, movements of Cain's body, a permanent trembling was a popular one, and blemishes associated with him. She then traced how the medieval imagination painted him and what it did to him. None of this is scripture. All of it is people who could not bear a blank. And now I have to tell you about the version of the blank filling that did the most damage, because it is still in circulation and it needs to be named accurately. Part 7. The two readings that were built to hurt people. At some point, someone decided the mark of Cain was black skin. I want to say very clearly what that claim is and is not. It is not in Genesis. There is no verse, in any manuscript tradition, in any ancient version that says anything about the colour of Cain's skin. The text does not describe the mark at all. That is not a matter of interpretation, that is a matter of what words are on the page. So where did it come from? David Goldenberg, whose book The Curse of Ham was published by Princeton University Press, and who has spent his career on exactly this question, traced it. And the trail leads somewhere unexpected. It appears to begin with a mistranslation in an Armenian apocryphal Adam book, a text from somewhere in the range of the 5th to the 11th century, which rendered the phrase in Genesis 4 verse 5, Cain's countenance fell, as though it meant his face turned dark. His face fell. His face darkened. In Hebrew, the first is an idiom for despair. In translation, it became a description of skin. From there, it spread slowly, gathered momentum in 17th century Europe, and then found its real market in the slave-holding societies of the Atlantic world, where it was enormously useful. It entered early Mormon thought in the 19th century as well, and shaped doctrine there for over a century. And Goldenberg documents something else that matters, because it clears up a confusion that is everywhere. There are two separate passages that got welded together. There is the mark of Cain in Genesis 4, and there is the curse Noah pronounces in Genesis 9 after the flood, a curse that, if you actually read it, falls on Canaan, Ham's son, and says nothing whatsoever about skin or about Africa. Two different chapters. Two different men. Two different situations. Later readers fused them into a single racial doctrine that neither text supports. Melenkoff's book has chapters on this too, on what she called intentionally distorted interpretations, and on how the mark of Cain was turned against Jews in medieval Europe. That is reception history. That is what people did with a silence. It is worth knowing precisely because it demonstrates the cost of filling in blanks that Scripture left empty. And there is a second reading I have to name, and then flag, and then leave. There is an idea called the serpent seed doctrine. Its claim is that Cain was not Adam's son at all, that the encounter in the garden was sexual, that the serpent fathered Cain, and that a line of literally demonic descent runs through human history from him. In its racial forms, it identifies that line with particular peoples. Here is its actual history. It draws on some scattered late speculation, but the version that circulates today is modern. It moved through British Israelism in the late 19th century, was developed into Christian identity theology by Wesley Swift, and was popularized in a sermon preached by the revivalist William Branham in Indiana in 1958. From there it was carried by Christian Identity, the Klan, and Aryan Nations, and the Anti-Defamation League documents it as a core component of that movement's theology, the claim that the Jewish people descend from that union and are therefore children of the devil. I am naming it because you will encounter it, and you should know what it is when you do. And it fails on the text in the first verse of the chapter we have been reading all along. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived, and she bore Cain. Genesis states Cain's paternity in its opening line and never wavers. The verse the doctrine leans on is in the first letter of John, where believers are told not to be like Cain, who was ectoponero of the evil one. But that Greek phrase is moral, not biological, and it is the same register John uses in his Gospel when Jesus tells his opponents they are of their father the devil. Nobody has ever taken that to mean literal parentage. It means moral allegiance. Mainstream Jewish and Christian scholarship rejects the serpent seed reading entirely, and so do I. That is the whole of what it deserves. Named, dated, refuted, and left behind. Now let us get back to Cain, because he is walking east, and the place he is walking toward has a name that tells you something. Part 8. The land called wandering. Genesis 4, verse 16. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. That is the last thing the Bible ever tells you about Cain's relationship with God. He went out from the presence of the Lord. There is no return, no later scene, no reconciliation. The most protected man in Genesis walks away from the one who protected him, and the narrative lets him go. Now, the land of Nod. Where is it? Nowhere, and I mean that precisely. The phrase the land of Nod occurs exactly once in the entire Bible, this verse, and never again. No prophet mentions it. No genealogy places it. No later writer locates it. Archaeologists have never had anything to look for, because there is nothing to look for. But the name is not empty. The name is a joke, and it is a very dark one. Nod in Hebrew is nod, from the root nun-vav dalet, which means to wander, to be a fugitive, to move restlessly, to be shaken. Gesenius, the great Hebrew lexicographer, glosses the root as to be moved, to be agitated, and thence to wander, to be a fugitive. Now go back 4 verses. What did God tell Cain he would be? Navanad, a restless wanderer, the same root. So when the text says Cain dwelt in the land of Nod, what it says in Hebrew is, the wanderer settled in the land of wandering. This is not a place name the way Egypt is a place name. Most scholars read it as an etymological name, a symbolic geography. A way of saying he lived nowhere, permanently. Some allow that a real region east of the Mesopotamian world might lie behind it. But the wordplay is so tight, and the name is so absent from the rest of Scripture, that the symbolic reading is where the weight of scholarship sits. And there is a second detail in that verse, and it is one of those quiet structural things that Genesis does over and over once you know to watch for it. East of Eden. In the primeval history and beyond, east is the direction of departure from God. Adam and Eve are driven out, and the cherubim are stationed at the east of the garden. Cain goes east. In Genesis 11, the builders of Babel journey from the east and settle in the plain of Shinar. When Abraham and Lot divide the land, Lot looks at the well-watered plain and journeys east, towards Sodom. Eastward, in Genesis, is the direction you go when you are moving away. So put the whole verse together and hear what it is actually saying. He went out from the presence of the Lord. He went east. And he settled, the verb is vayeshev, the ordinary Hebrew verb for sitting down, dwelling, staying put, in the land of wandering. Do you see the contradiction sitting in that sentence? He was sentenced to never settle, and the very next thing he does is settle. That contradiction is not a mistake in the text. It is the beginning of everything Cain does for the rest of the chapter, because a man who has been told he will never have a home does not simply accept that. He builds one, and then he builds walls around it. But before the walls, there is a woman, and the text introduces her in the most maddening way possible. Part 9. The wife the Bible refuses to explain. Genesis 4 verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. That is it. That is her entire introduction, her entire biography, and her entire exit. No name, no parents, no origin, no explanation of how a man alone in the land of wandering, east of everything, comes to have a wife at all. This is the question that gets asked in every Sunday school class on earth, usually by a 12-year-old and usually to visible discomfort. Where did Cain's wife come from? let me handle it the way I want to handle everything in this story. First, what the text says. Then what the text does not say. Then what other people said, clearly labelled as other people. What the text says is nothing. That is the whole of it. Genesis 4 does not answer the question, and shows no awareness that it is a question. What the text says elsewhere is one relevant thing. Genesis chapter 5 verse 4, in the middle of the genealogy of Adam, notes that after the birth of Seth, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Other sons. And daughters. That is the basis of the traditional answer, and the traditional answer is straightforward and uncomfortable. Cain married a sister, or a niece. Sana, who is not in the business of making the text easier, says flatly that in the narrative context as it stands, no other possibility exists. The obvious objection is the one you are already forming. Leviticus prohibits exactly this. Chapters 18 and 20 of Leviticus forbid sexual relations between siblings in strong terms, and the traditional answer to that objection is that those laws had not been given, that they came at Sinai thousands of years later, and that in the first generations of humanity such marriages were a necessary and permitted concession. That is a coherent position, and it is the one taken by traditional Jewish commentators and by conservative Christian readers today. Now the interesting part. Ancient readers were bothered by this too, and we can prove it, because we can watch them fixing it. The Book of Jubilees is a Jewish work written around the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. It is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus. It is not in the Jewish or Protestant or Catholic canon, and it survives in full only in Ethiopic. And Jubilees chapter 4 does something Genesis never does. It names her. It says Cain took his sister Awan as a wife, and she bore him Enoch. Awan, a name that appears nowhere in the Bible, invented or preserved by a writer working more than a millennium after the events he is describing, precisely because he could feel the gap. Another text, Pseudo-Philo, gives Cain a wife named Themech and does not call her his sister. Later traditions produce still more names, Kalmana, Lulua, Aklima. Every one of them is an ancient reader, doing what we all do, filling a silence. And here is the part that is rarely said out loud, so I am going to say it. There is a second problem in the chapter, and the sibling answer does not solve it. Go back to Cain's protest. Anyone who finds me will kill me. Who is anyone? If the entire human population is Adam, Eve, and Cain, who is he afraid of? And then God's response, that whoever kills Cain will suffer sevenfold vengeance. A threat that presupposes people to threaten. And then a city. You do not build a city for a family of 4. Critical scholarship reads this as a real seam in the narrative. On that reading, the chapter is functioning as an etiology, an origin story for civilization, for professions, and specifically for a people, as we will see near the end of tonight. And an etiology of a tribe does not require and does not try to supply a universal population census. The story is not answering the question, because the story was never asking it. So you have a range of positions, and I will lay them out honestly rather than pretending there is one. Traditional readers, a sister or niece, permitted before the law. Critical scholars, a narrative seam in a text with different concerns than ours. And there is a third option that gets floated periodically, that there were other humans outside the garden altogether, which I will flag rather than endorse, because in its historical forms it has been tangled up with racial theorizing, and because it requires reading into Genesis, something Genesis does not offer. What is not in dispute is the strangeness of the verse itself. In one sentence, a woman appears, becomes a mother, and vanishes. The mother of the entire line we are about to follow, the line that invents music and metal and murder songs, is given no name at all, and her son gets something no one else in the story gets. He gets a city named after him. Part 10. The Wanderer Who Built a Wall. Genesis 4, verse 17, second half. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Read that again with the sentence from 3 verses earlier in your head. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. And he built a city. This is to me the single most human moment in the entire chapter. A man is told he will never belong anywhere. And so he lays out foundations, and he raises walls, and he plants his son's name on the gate. Let us be precise about what the word means, because city in English calls up something that did not exist for thousands of years. The Hebrew is Ir. In the ancient Near East, an Ir is not a metropolis, it is an enclosure, a fortified settlement, often startlingly small by our standards, a few acres. A wall, a gate, and inside it a cluster of mud brick houses. The defining feature is not size, it is the wall. The defining feature is that something is being kept out. Now what should you picture? Not Genesis, but the archaeology of what the earliest walled settlements in that part of the world actually looked like, and I want to be careful here, because this is background, not identification. Nobody has excavated the city of Enoch, and nobody ever will. But at Tel Es Sultan, ancient Jericho, in the pre-pottery Neolithic, there is a stone tower 8.5 meters high, built around 8,000 years before Christ, attached to a massive stone wall around a settlement that may have held 2,000 or 3,000 people. That is what the first cities were. Not skylines. A wall, a tower, a few thousand people, and a great deal of effort spent on defence. At Atalike in Anatolia, the UNESCO listing describes 18 levels of Neolithic occupation stacked between roughly 7,400 and 6,200 years before Christ, on a site occupied for more than 2,000 years. Houses packed wall to wall, entered through the roof. That is the physical world the word Ir belongs to. Dense, defensive, and built by people who had decided that whatever was outside was worse than whatever crowding was inside. The ancient Mesopotamians had their own tradition about the first city, and it is worth knowing for contrast. The Sumerian king list, one copy of which is on a clay prism now in Oxford, opens with a line that reads, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Eridu was the first city in that tradition, and the first king ruled there for 28,800 years. You will occasionally see people try to map Cain's city onto Eridu, sometimes by noticing that Enoch's son is named Irad, and that Irad contains the consonants of Ir. That is speculation. Interesting speculation, but speculation, and I am not going to sell it to you as a finding. Now Josephus again, and this time he goes much further than Genesis does. In the Antiquities, Josephus turns Cain's city into the founding crime of civilization itself. He writes that Cain increased his wealth by robbery and violence, that he taught others to be corrupt, that he ended the simplicity people had lived in by inventing weights and measures, that he fixed boundaries around land, and that he built a city and fortified it with walls and compelled his people to gather in one place. Weights, measures, property lines. Walls, that is Josephus reading Cain as the inventor of everything that lets people take from each other systematically. It is a magnificent piece of interpretation, and it is not what Genesis says. Genesis says he built a city and named it after his son. That is all. Everything else is Josephus. One more thing about that city, and it is a distinction I need you to hold on to, because it trips up an enormous number of readers. The Enoch this city is named for is not the famous Enoch. There are 2 men named Enoch in the opening chapters of Genesis, and they are in two different family lines. This one in Genesis 4 is Cain's son, and a city is named for him, and then he fathers Irad and disappears. The other Enoch in Genesis 5 is in the line of Seth, seventh from Adam, and about him the text says one of the most extraordinary sentences in the Bible: Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Two Enochs. One gets a wall, the other gets taken. Do not confuse them, because the family we are following is the first one, and the next three names in it will change the world. Part 11. The Inventors. Genesis 4 gives you a genealogy, and genealogies are where most readers' eyes glaze. Do not let them, because this one stops in the middle and tells you something. The line runs Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, Lamech, and when it reaches Lamech, the text slows down and gives him two wives, Ada and Zillah, and then it names their children, and it tells you what each of them started. Jabal, he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, nomadic pastoralism, the whole tent and herd way of life. Jubal, he was the father of all who play the lyre and the pipe. Music, the kinnor and the ugav, string and wind. Tubal-cain, he was a forger of every implement of bronze and iron. Metallurgy, three brothers, three foundations. Herding, music and metal. And the names are a wordplay all the way through. Jabal, Jabal, Tubal, three near rhymes built on roots meaning to bring or to produce, with Jabal echoing Yovel, the ram's horn. And there is a sister, Naamah. She is named and then nothing is said about her, another silence in a chapter full of them. Now here is the observation that scholars keep circling back to, and it is genuinely uncomfortable if you have been taught to read this chapter as a simple morality tale. Every one of the arts of civilization, in Genesis, comes from Cain's line, not from Seth, not from the godly branch. Music, animal husbandry, and metalworking, the technologies that make settled human culture possible, are attributed by the text to the descendants of the first murderer. Genesis does not condemn them for it. It also does not praise them. It simply reports that this is where these things came from and leaves you holding it. That ambivalence is the point. Culture is real, and culture is good, and culture came out of the cursed line, and the text will not resolve that for you. There is an ancient Near Eastern parallel worth knowing here. Mesopotamian tradition had the Apkallu, 7 sages, semi-divine figures who lived before the flood and brought humanity the arts of civilization. Same shape of story, the fundamentals of culture delivered by named figures in the world before the deluge. Genesis is telling a recognizably ancient kind of story, and telling it its own way. And now, the detail that critical scholars point at, and that I would be dishonest to skip. Tubal-cain forges bronze and iron. Iron, in a narrative set at the dawn of humanity. Widespread ironworking in the Levant belongs to the Iron Age, roughly from 1200 before Christ onwards. Copper smelting is far older, back into the 5th and 4th millennia. But iron, in the primeval world of Genesis 4, is an anachronism, and most critical scholars read it as the narrator's own world projected backwards. On that reading, the verse is doing what origin stories do. It credits technologies the audience already knows to named ancestors in the deep past. Conservative readers push back, arguing that the evidence for how early iron could be worked is thinner than usually claimed, and that isolated early ironworking is not impossible. You now know both positions. I will let you weigh them. One more thing, and this one is a genuine open problem in the field. Compare Cain's genealogy in Genesis 4 with Seth's genealogy in Genesis 5, side by side. Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, Lamech, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech. Look at those. Enoch appears in both. Irad and Jared, Mehujael and Mahalalel, Methushael and Methuselah, Cain and Kenan, and both lists end at a man named Lamech. Source critics, going back to Westermann and the classical documentary approach, argue that these are two developments of one original name list, split between different sources and given different characters. Gordon Wenham pushes back hard, pointing out that only Enoch and Lamech are exact matches, and that what the two lists say about their men could not be more opposed. Cain's Enoch has a city, Seth's Enoch walks with God and vanishes. Cain's Lamech is a killer who boasts. Seth's Lamech fathers Noah. That debate is not settled, and I am not going to pretend to settle it for you. What is beyond dispute is that the two lists are related somehow, and that the narrator has arranged them so that you are meant to compare them, and when you do compare them, the comparison lands hardest at the end. Because both lines terminate in a Lamech, and one of those Lamechs opens his mouth and sings. Part 12. The Song of the Sword. Genesis 4, verses 23 and 24. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. That is a poem. Not prose with rhythm, an actual poem, with the parallel line structure that defines Hebrew verse, and many scholars regard it as among the oldest poetry preserved anywhere in Genesis. One 19th century reference work called it the only example of antediluvian poetry we have. It has been known for centuries as the Song of the Sword, and I want you to hear how it is built, because the construction is the horror. He summons an audience. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. This is not a confession made in private to God the way Cain's protest was. This is a performance. He gathers his wives and he recites. Then the boast. I have killed a man for wounding me. Notice the proportion, not for killing, for wounding. A young man struck him, and he killed him for it, and he has set it to verse. And then the arithmetic. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. He knows the story. 7 generations down from the murder, the family still remembers the 7-fold protection God swore over Cain, and Lamech takes it, multiplies it by 11, and claims it for himself. That is the moment the line completes its arc. Because think about what the 7-fold vengeance originally was. It was God's, and it was defensive, and it existed to keep a frightened man from being killed. It was a limit on violence. Lamech has taken the limit and turned it into a threat. Divine restraint has become human swagger. Protection has become policy. Nobody swore anything over Lamech. He swore it over himself. There is a real ambiguity in the Hebrew here, and it is worth knowing about because it changes the flavour of the poem. The verb form is a perfect, which normally reports completed action, I have killed. But Hebrew perfects can also be used in a conditional or anticipatory sense, and some read the line as a threat rather than a report, I would kill any man who wounds me. On that reading, Lamech has not killed anyone yet. He is standing in front of his wives boasting about what he could do, and doing it, pointedly, just after the text has told you that his son Tubal-cain forges implements of bronze and iron. Either way, it is the same man. The only question is whether the blood is already on the ground, and look at what else has quietly happened by this point in the family line. Lamech has 2 wives, Ada and Zillah. This is the first polygamy in the Bible, dropped in without comment, and it arrives in the same paragraph as the first boast about murder. Genesis does not editorialize. Genesis just puts them next to each other. Now, the traditions, because later readers wanted to know who Lamech killed, and they came up with an answer that has been painted on cathedral walls. There is a widespread legend, appearing in midrashic collections and engaged in rabbinic literature, that the man Lamech killed was Cain himself. In the story, Lamech has grown very old and gone blind, and he hunts with his son Tubal-cain guiding his aim. Tubal-cain sees something moving in the brush and tells his father it is an animal. Lamech shoots, and what falls is Cain, killed like a beast, 7 generations after the murder, by his own descendant, by accident. In some versions, Lamech realizes what he has done and claps his hands together in grief, and the blow kills Tubal-cain too. In some versions, Tubal-cain deceived him on purpose. James Kugel has traced how that legend developed, and John Byron's book on Cain and Abel in Text and Tradition follows its afterlife. And you can go and look at it. There is a capital carved in the 12th century in the Cathedral at Autun in France, showing exactly this scene. Medieval Europe knew this story better than it knew the actual text. But it is not the actual text. Genesis does not say who Lamech killed. It does not say Lamech went blind. It does not say Cain died in the brush. That is legend. Beautiful, satisfying legend that closes the circle the way we want it closed, and legend is what it is. There is one more echo, and it is the one that turns the whole thing over, and I want to give it to you with its debate attached. Centuries later, in Matthew's Gospel, Peter comes to Jesus and asks how many times he must forgive his brother. As many as 7 times? And Jesus answers, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Or 77, depending on how you render the Greek, the same ambiguity that sits in the Hebrew of Lamech's poem. Many readers, including serious commentators, hear that as a deliberate inversion, Lamech's number, taken and reversed. The arithmetic of vengeance converted into the arithmetic of forgiveness, spoken by a man from the line of the brother who was not there. Other scholars are cautious about it. They point out that Jesus is also plausibly drawing on Jubilee language from Leviticus 25, and that a numerical echo across 2 testaments is not by itself proof of intent. I lean toward hearing the echo. But I am telling you it is debated, because it is, and because the story is strong enough that it does not need me to overstate it. Part 13. The way the chapter was built. I want to step back from the events for a moment and look at the construction, because Genesis 4 is not a loose collection of episodes. It is engineered. And once you see the engineering, a couple of things become visible that you cannot see at ground level. Start with a word count. In the 16 verses that run from the birth of the brothers to Cain's departure, one word appears 7 times, brother. Ach, in Hebrew. 7, in a book that uses 7 structurally everywhere. And here is what Mark McIntyre noticed about those 7. Every single one of them identifies Abel as the brother of Cain. His brother Abel. Where is Abel your brother? Your brother's blood. Am I my brother's keeper? The relationship is stated over and over from one direction and never from the other. Abel is never described as having a brother. He only ever is one. Ellen Van Wold put it in a sentence that I have not been able to shake since I first read it, quoted by Miroslav Volf in his book. On exclusion and embrace, Cain has a brother but is not a brother, whereas Abel is a brother but does not have a brother. That is not an accident of style. That is a narrator hammering one nail 7 times. Now, the larger shape. Scholars who work on Hebrew narrative structure have long read Genesis 4 as what Gordon Wenham, borrowing a term from Sean McEvenew, calls a polystrophe, what most of us would call a chiasm. The chapter folds around a centre. At the outer edge, the 2 brothers approach God with offerings. Moving inward, God speaks to Cain, the warning about the thing at the door. At the centre, one verse, the murder. Then moving back out, God speaks to Cain again, the interrogation, the curse, the sign. And at the outer edge again, Cain goes out from the presence of the Lord. The chapter opens with two men approaching God and closes with one man walking away from him. And balanced on the pivot point, in the shortest sentence in the passage, is a body in a field. That is deliberate architecture. Whoever composed this knew exactly what they were doing. And there is a second structure layered on top of it, one that runs across chapters rather than within one. Compare Genesis 3 to Genesis 4. Wenham laid this out in an essay on original sin in the primeval history, and the parallel is close enough to be startling. In chapter 3, a scene, then a dialogue, then the sin, then a dialogue of interrogation, then a curse, then a sentence of expulsion eastward, and then a moment where God does something protective for the people he has just sentenced. He clothes them. In chapter 4, a scene, then a dialogue, then the sin, then a dialogue of interrogation, then a curse, then a sentence of expulsion eastward, and then a moment where God does something protective for the man he has just sentenced. He gives him a sign. Same skeleton. Twice, and the second time the sin has escalated from disobedience to murder, and the interrogation is met not with excuses, but with a shrug. Scholars have a name for the pattern that runs through both of these, and onward through the primeval history. Gerhard von Rad and Claus Westermann traced it, and David Kleins gave it its clearest formulation. Sin, then a divine speech of judgment, then punishment, and then, every time, an act of grace that keeps the story alive. Adam and Eve are expelled and clothed, Cain is exiled and marked, and when the flood comes, humanity is destroyed and one family is put in a boat. Judgment, then a mitigation, every time. It is the rhythm of the whole opening of the Bible, which tells you something about the sign on Cain that no amount of word study can. The mark is not an anomaly. It is not God going soft in one strange verse. It is exactly what this narrator has been showing you God doing since the garden, handing down a real sentence and then, without cancelling it, leaving the condemned a way to keep breathing. And it also tells you where the chapter is heading, because the pattern has a direction. The sins get worse and the mitigations get thinner, and the arc runs from a fruit to a body to a man singing about murder in front of his wives, to a sentence in chapter 6 that says the earth was filled with violence. So the last question about Cain is the one the chapter never answers. If the sign kept him alive, how long did it keep him alive? What happened to him in the end? And the honest answer to that is going to be shorter than you expect. Part 14. What happened to him, and what people needed to believe happened to him. So how did Cain die? The Bible does not say. I want to let that sit, because in a chapter that gives us his sentence, his protest, his sign, his destination, his marriage, his son, his city, and 7 generations of his descendants, there is no death notice, no age at death, the way Genesis 5 gives an age at death for every man in Seth's line. No burial, no final scene. Cain builds a city, and the camera simply moves off him. Genesis 5, the chapter that follows, does not even acknowledge him. It restarts the human genealogy from Adam through Seth as though the 4th chapter had not happened, and people could not stand that, so they wrote endings. The Book of Jubilees, again 2nd century before Christ, not canonical anywhere, says Cain died in the same year as Adam, crushed when the stones of his own house fell on him. And Jubilees tells you exactly why it chose that ending, because with a stone he killed Abel, and by a stone he was killed, in righteous judgment. That is a writer building a moral, and building it well. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in Genesis Rabbah, held that the sign was a suspension of judgment, and that the flood eventually swept Cain away. The punishment deferred for 10 generations, and then delivered by water, and the medieval favourite is the one we just heard, the blind Lamech and the arrow in the brush. 3 endings. All of them satisfying, none of them scripture. What later writers did have was Cain the symbol, and he became one of the most useful figures in ancient literature. Josephus, as we saw, made him the founder of exploitation. Philo of Alexandria made him an idea. In his treatises on the sacrifices of Abel and Cain, and on the worse attacking the better, Cain is philausia, self-love, the principle in a person that must diminish everything else to feel large. And the New Testament uses him 3 times, in 3 different ways. Hebrews 11, in the great chapter on faith, says Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice by faith, the interpretive answer to the silence we sat in earlier. 1 John 3 says, "Do not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother." The Greek verb there, esphaxen, is a butcher's word, a word for slaughtering an animal. And, as we covered, the phrase of the evil one is moral, not genealogical. And Jude, in a single fierce verse, puts Cain in a list, woe to them, for they went the way of Cain and abandoned themselves to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. The way of Cain. Richard Borkham, in his commentary on Jude, places that phrase in a stream of Second Temple Jewish tradition, in which Cain had become the archetype of the man who does not believe in coming judgment, and who takes others down with him, which is a striking place to land, because it is not primarily about murder at all. In that tradition, the way of Cain is the way of a man who concludes that nothing is finally accountable. So that is the man as the ancient world remembered him. No death, no grave, no age, and an enormous and growing shadow. But there is one more thread, and it is the one I have been holding back all night, because it is the strangest and best attested thing in this whole story, and almost nobody in a pew has ever heard it. Cain's name does not disappear from the Bible. It shows up again hundreds of years later attached to a tribe, and the Bible speaks well of them. Part 15. The tribe that carried his name. In Hebrew, Cain is Cain, and there is a people in the Hebrew Bible called the Chinai. In English we render them, for practical purposes, the same word, and the connection is not something a modern scholar imposed on the text makes it itself. In the book of Numbers, in the oracles of Balaam, Balaam looks out and speaks over the Kenite, and the Hebrew puns openly on the name of Cain as he does it. So who were they? The Kenites were a nomadic people of the arid south, the region of Midian, the edges of Edom, the Negev, the Arabah Valley. They were tent dwellers, and they were metal workers, and that root, Cain, carries the trade in it. Across the Semitic languages, the consonants Quian cluster around metalwork. In Arabic, Cain is a smith, a craftsman. In Aramaic and Syriac, the same root gives you metalworker. And in the second book of Samuel there is a passage where the word Cain appears meaning a weapon, a spearhead, a piece of forged bronze. Cain's name, in the ancient world, was very close to the word for a smith. Now go back to Genesis 4 with that in your ears. Tubal-cain, forger of every implement of bronze and iron. Jabal, father of those who dwell in tents. Jubal, father of those who play the lyre and pipe. Metal, tents, music, that is a description of the Kenites. Genesis 4 is not only telling you about one man, it is functioning, at least in part, as the origin story of a specific people, nomadic, musical, working copper in the wilderness of the south. And here is where it becomes genuinely remarkable, and I need to be careful about how much weight I put on it. The Kenites in the Bible are on the right side. Moses' father-in-law, called Jethro, called Roel, and his son called Hobab, is a priest of Midian, and Judges identifies that family as Kenite. It is Jethro who receives Moses when he flees Egypt. Jethro who gives him his daughter, and Jethro who in Exodus 18 offers sacrifice to the God of Israel and then teaches Moses how to govern. In Judges, Heber the Kenite has pitched his tent near Kadesh, and it is his wife Jael who kills Sisera, the commander of the enemy army, and the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest poems in the Bible, calls her most blessed of women. And in Jeremiah 35, there is a clan called the Rechabites, descended from the Kenites, who live in tents and drink no wine and refuse to settle, and Jeremiah holds them up in front of Jerusalem as an example of faithfulness that puts the city to shame. Tent dwellers who refuse to settle down. Praised, by name, by a prophet. And there is a scholarly theory built on all of this, and it is one of the more serious hypotheses in the study of Israelite religion. It is usually called the Kenite hypothesis. In its basic form, it proposes that the worship of Yahweh reached Israel from the south, from Midianite and Kenite territory, through Moses' encounter with his Kenite father-in-law. It is an old theory, going back to the 19th century, and it has been revived and refined in recent decades by scholars including Baruch Halpern and Karel van der Toorn. Nissim Amzalag, in an article in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, has argued for a deep original link between Yahweh and metallurgy. I want to be exact about the epistemic status of this, because it would be easy to oversell. It is a hypothesis, it is taken seriously, it is well argued, and it is contested. It is not established fact, and I am not presenting it as one. But hold the pieces together and feel the shape of it. A man named Smith kills his brother and is driven into the wilderness of the south, marked for protection, and his descendants become tent dwellers who work metal and play music. Centuries later, a tribe bearing his name is living in that same wilderness, working that same metal, and when the great deliverer of Israel runs for his life into the desert, it is into that tribe's tents that he runs, and it is their priest who offers the sacrifice. Whatever you make of the historical hypothesis, the literary shape is undeniable, and it is in your Bible. The name attached to the first murder does not end in disgrace. It ends attached to a people the scriptures honour. That is the thing about the sign. In the end. It worked. God swore that Cain would not be destroyed, and Cain was not destroyed. Not by the men he feared in the land of wandering, and not by the memory of what he had done. The line survived. The name survived. It survived so thoroughly that it comes walking back into the story 1,000 years later, in the desert, offering sacrifice. I said at the beginning that the first thing God did after the first murder was protect the murderer. I want to leave you with what that actually cost the story. Genesis 4 does not give Cain forgiveness. There is no reconciliation, no restoration, no scene where he comes home. He goes out from the presence of the Lord and he never comes back, and the text is unflinching about that. What he is given is smaller and stranger than forgiveness. He is given a limit on what can be done to him. He is given permission to keep breathing in a world where he does not belong. And it turns out that is enough for a city to get built, and for music to be invented, and for a tribe to come out of the desert 700 years later, carrying his name into the tent of the man who would lead Israel out of Egypt. But it was not enough to stop what came next, because you have heard where this line ends. It ends with a man standing in front of his wives, singing about a killing, taking God's number and multiplying it for his own. And 2 chapters later, Genesis tells you that the earth was filled with violence, Hamas, in Hebrew, the word for wrong done by force, and that God looked at it and grieved. From one murder in a field to a world that has to be washed away. And in the middle of that descent, in the other family line, in the 7th generation from Adam, there is a man with the same name as Cain's son, a man about whom Genesis says 4 words and then stops. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not. because God took him. The Bible tells you almost nothing about him, but other people wrote a great deal, an entire body of literature, claiming to record what he saw when he was taken, and what he was shown about the sons of God, and about the days just before the water came. That is where we go next. 2 Enochs, 2 lions, and the one who did not die.